Every now and then, someone makes fun of my length of sermons. And normally, those someone's are people that are part of my family. That's just kind of how it is. And I guess, yeah, sometimes I know I preach a little long, but anytime anybody ever asks me, how long do you preach? I always say the same thing. I preach until it's done. Because sometimes, when you're preaching, you feel like you just got to make that one more point. And then other times you go, wow, I shouldn't have made that one more point because it made it a little long. Um, anyway, the reason I'm talking about this is because I ran across a story. I mean, I'd heard this story before, but I ran across one and I thought, you know what? This is just such an interesting story. I just got to read it and see if I can actually pull off a devotional on it. So this is what happens. Paul he goes to Macedonia and to Greece, and now he's getting ready to leave where he is, and then he's going to head off to another place. And so the night before he's going to do this is what happens. This is from Acts chapter 20. I'm going to start at verse 7. It says this: On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them, that is the church that's there, since he intended to leave the next day. He continued to speak until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting, and a young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul was still talking longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 stories below, and he was picked up dead. But Paul went down and, bending over him, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is with him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broke bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive, and they were a little comforted. What a weird story, right? Which explains maybe why I'm sitting on a windowsill. I thought that might be a way to bring this story to life. Now, it's not 3 stories down, but can you imagine this story? Well, here's the thing. I found myself asking, why did the author of Acts, most people believe it was Luke, one of the companions, why did Luke choose to include this weird story about Paul preaching all night long and then all day long? Why would this story be included? And so I did some research and I tried to find, does anybody have any ideas about this story? And this one person that I read said, you need to look at what's really happening in this story. He says, first of all, it's a late night meeting. The meeting starts at night. And he says, you have to ask yourself why. And he makes this point. He says, these church members were laborers and they probably worked all day long. And they worked all day long, but then their only time to gather then would be late at night after everybody was done working. And so this group was tired. They met all night, or they had worked all day long, and yet it was so important that they came together. It was so important that they heard what Paul had to say. Even if he's going to be longer than Pastor Scott's going to preach, they thought it was worth it for them to stay there and listen because they knew how important the message was that Paul was bringing them. The second thing he pointed out was, he said, the lamps were, or the room was filled with lamps. And he made the point that not only would this bring light to the room, but it would also bring a lot of heat to the room. And so this author imagined, the third thing, he said, I imagined that this was probably a crowded room. And the boy, when you think about it, when you first hear this weird story, you sort of, why is he sitting in such a dangerous place? The guy makes the point, this is probably the smartest place to sit because he's probably sitting by a window so that he can get some air in this stuffy room that's there. But the problem is he falls asleep. He falls asleep and he falls outside the window. Now, on the one hand, it's a miraculous story of healing, right? I mean, it says that he fell down and they saw him dead on the ground. But then Paul goes and he lays his body down on the boy. And this is actually how in the Old Testament prophets would lay their body down on someone to bring them back to life or bring healing to that person. And so that's what Paul does. He lays himself down, and then he says he's not dead. He's alive. And sure enough, the boy's alive. What's interesting is, and again, this author points this out, what's interesting is after this big traumatic event has happened, what do? They go right back to worshiping. They go back right back to breaking bread, and Paul goes right back on to preaching. It's like this message and what's going on in the church in that day is just so important that they're going to do everything they can to make worship, to make this learning about Jesus the biggest priority in their life. Even when they're exhausted and tired and worn out, being together as a community of faith, hearing the message was the biggest priority they had. And so again, this author says, yeah, this is a weird story. It's talking about some boy that falls out the window in the midst of a really, really long sermon, right? But it's also a story that shows us just how committed these early church members, these men and women were. And this young boy desperately wants to be there. Even when he's at the point of exhaustion, he's desperate to be there. I wonder if there's a little bit of that desperation in us as well. Are we desperate to hear the voice of God?